Yeah.
I hope everyone's having a good Friday. Today, I'll take you on a trip that's a little farther away than the United States. We're headed to São Francisco Island, Brazil, and we're looking at a time scale of about 70,000 years. So not geologically as far as some people in geology go, but farther than the modern. To start, I'll just give an overview of my presentation. Part of my work was made possible this summer by participating in the VIMS REU, so I'll just go over that experience, and if anyone has questions afterward about what an REU is like, feel free to ask that. And then I'll get into the research that I did this summer and how that connects to the work that I'm doing for my senior thesis. So for the VIMS REU, normally we get to go into VIMS every day and work in the lab and stay on William & Mary's campus. But this summer, that wasn't the case. We met over Zoom 2 or 3 times a week and got to go to some cool seminars about life after academia and what careers you could have, or learning how to use R. So it was a great experience to see what research looks like in a professional aspect like at VIMS. And I also had the unique opportunity as a part of the Coastal Geo Lab to go out and do field work, even though we were in a remote REU experience. I got to go out and help Kayla Cahoon collect data for her master's thesis. So even though I was doing only work on the computer for my project this summer, I got to see research from the computer side and from the field side out on the Eastern Shore. And now I'll just move into the research I did this summer. But before I start, I need to talk about how sediment moves along the coast at all. We are talking about coastal systems, and sediment, the coastal sediment transport process I'm really interested in talking about today is longshore transport, which is when waves pick up sand and are carrying sand and hit the coast at an angle. And then as they recede back out to the ocean, they move perpendicular to shore, dropping off sand and picking up sand as they move along with a net direction in the direction of the wave movement. And in my system, longshore transport is to the north. So that's why I've drawn the arrow in that direction. But sometimes there are impediments along the coast, such as headlands, which is what we're focusing on today. And we are trying to understand how sand moves around these impediments to reach the beach's downdrift of these rocky headlands. And longshore transport is still carrying those sand, but there's a balance between the volume of sand within the space between the headlands and the volume of sand that is actually able to move around those headlands. The space between those headlands is called accommodation, which is just the available space that there is for sediment to fill. Think of it like a container that has a certain volume for sand to fill up, and eventually there is no more room for the sand and it has to move downdrift along the coast where it has somewhere else to land and stay. But why does headland bypassing even matter? In the modern, a lot of systems where headland bypassing occurs are actually places where land is building out even when sea level is rising. And so understanding how this land progradation is happening even when sea level is rising is really important, especially in relation to how people are armoring coasts in unnatural ways and how sand will move around these new man-made impediments along the coast compared to how sand moves around natural impediments or headlands along rocky coasts. To study this, we are looking, we asked the research question, how does inherited topography impact the geometric relationships of headland bypassing landforms as sediment accumulates through time? So to break down this question, inherited topography are just those rocky headlands. And headland bypassing landforms are anything from migrating subaqueous bars or sandbars migrating underwater, bars migrating subaerially or appearing above the surface of the water, or it could include spits, which are just bodies of sand that are attached to the shore along one side. And if you're not familiar with what a spit is, in the picture on the left is a famous spit off of the coast of North Carolina on the Outer Banks. That's just attached to the shore on one side, and this is the end that protrudes into the body of water. So to ask this question, we are using the study site of São Francisco Island on the southern coast of Brazil. So I'll just zoom you in there. And here is a study site, a map of a study site, which demonstrates how São Francisco is really great for studying headland bypassing on both geologic timescales, or here thousands of years, and historic timescales. And first, it's really great geologically because of a ridge that runs between these two headlands on São Francisco Island, Forte Headland and Ubatuba Headland. And this ridge is 8 meters tall, which is higher than the last sea level high stand, which was about 6,000 years ago. And most of the other landforms on São Francisco do Sul fall below that 4-meter sea level. So we know that that ridge is the oldest sedimentary landform on the island, and all of the other landforms most of the other landforms are younger than that sea level high stand when sea level began falling again. Another reason that São Francisco is good for studying headland bypassing on geologic timescales are these complicated superficial landforms on the western side of the island that I've highlighted in blue. Because usually when things are complicated on the surface, they're also complicated underneath. And we're trying to understand those complex relationships of these landforms under the ground. On modern timescales, São Francisco Island is good for studying headland bypassing because we have evidence of how quickly headland bypassing happens here in the modern. We have a time lapse of 30 years that shows 3 spits growing within that 30-year time period off of Forte Headland. You can see the spit forming and migrating and accreting to the northern coast of São Francisco Island. So having this modern analog for how quickly headland bypassing occurs today is really important for understanding how headland bypassing happened in the past. So to target our research question, I'm going to be talking about 2 of the methods that I'm using in my research. The first is ground penetrating radar, which is a method that records the changes in properties of sediment by sending radar waves underground and collecting their time for reflection. And sediment properties are anything from water content to organic content to mineralogy or grain size, which those changes are just indicative of maybe a change in wave energy or a change in sediment supply. And that shows up in the GPR as changes in the reflectors, which are shown in this picture in the bottom left. In the field, collecting GPR looks like this. I sadly did not get to go to Brazil to collect the data, but here's my advisor, Chris Hine, with the GPR in the car, and then running behind the car is this antenna that actually sends the waves underground for the system to identify. And we took 45 GPR lines, or Chris took 45 GPR lines on São Francisco Island for us to understand how these landforms relate to each other. The other method that I'll be talking about today is optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, which gives us dates for certain landforms on São Francisco Island. And it's a method that looks at the last time that certain minerals were exposed to sunlight, or the last time or the time before they were buried. And our dates use quartz and feldspar grains. So analyzing the GPR lines is pretty complicated. You do pre-processing GPR to get the lines to look like what they did on the last slide to here. And I'll just walk you through a little bit about what you'll see on the future slides. So on the y-axis here, you have the depth in relation to meters above mean sea level. Here is sea level is 0. And so this line demonstrates 3 meters above mean sea level, and then also goes 6 meters below mean sea level. And then on the x-axis is just the distance of the line. So after we did pre-processing, I have to go in and trace every individual reflector within the GPR lines to determine the dominant reflector architecture, which is just a fancy word for determining the geometry of the reflectors within the GPR lines. And so that's just dip direction and dip angle of the reflectors. And something that's really important to point out is that these lines are really vertically exaggerated. So these reflectors look like they're dipping really steeply, but really they're dipping only about 4 or 5 degrees. So the vertical exaggeration just allows us to be able to visualize the dip angles more easily. So to be able to conceptualize our results a little more easily, I split up the different types of reflector geometries into facies, or 4 sets of reflectors that share similar characteristics. The first one we'll go over is the ridge facies, which is characterized by chaotic reflectors bound by oblique reflectors on either side. And this is what the ridge facies looks like. You can see the chaotic reflectors in the middle, and this is what my analysis looked like, tracing all of the reflectors, and you can see the oblique reflectors on the other side. And this is really characteristic of aeolian-built systems or dunes, which is what we're interpreting the ridge that connects the 2 headlands of São Francisco do Sul to be as a dune ridge. And then you can see the oblique reflectors represent the beach prograding out onto the ocean on one side and the bay on the other side. The next facies is the channel facies, and channels are erosional features. So you'll see them cutting through uniform near parallel horizontal reflectors, and the channels will be U-shaped or concave up. On the left, you see a really common example of channels that we saw all over São Francisco do Sul. You can see the U-shaped concave up reflectors and then the parallel reflectors on either side, and even inside of the channel where it was filled in as more sediment was traveling to fill over the channel. On the right side of the screen, you can see a really interesting, unique channel that we saw on São Francisco Island. You can see the wide concave up shape, but then you can also see these reflectors that look like the channel was migrating. And so as sand was being brought over into the channel was migrating eastward and cutting into the pre-existing sediment until it couldn't migrate anymore, and sand kept accumulating and filling in the channel. The next set of reflectors is a spit facies, which are characterized by oblique reflectors that dip in the same direction. You can see here all the reflectors dip eastward westward. And you can see I've outlined these little packages in lighter gray in the bottom, and that maybe represents times when there was a storm that brought big volumes of sand that all accumulated in the same direction and at the same dip angle. But sand is accumulating here all the time, even when there aren't changes in wave energy. One thing to remember is the vertical exaggeration. So while these lines look really steep, they actually only dip about 1 degree. So the land of São Francisco Island is really flat. And then the last sequence is the stacked facies, which represents a vertical sequence of different reflector orientations. So it combines the channel and the spit and other sand accumulation into one sequence altogether. So here you can see all of the changing different reflector orientations as you move up vertically through the GPR radar. And that would maybe be indicative of changing wave energy or changing sediment accumulation rates or sand volume that would make the land need to build off in a different direction. So how did we put all of these different 45 GPR lines together to lead our interpretation? I mapped all of the different dip directions to be able to try to orient all of these lines together. And from there, we interpreted a evolutionary model of how the land formed at São Francisco Island. And because we had those optically stimulated luminescent states, we actually have a time frame through which these landforms developed. So here we have time zero, which is when the only landforms that were there were the two headlands and then the dune ridge, which we have dated to between 75,000 and 68,000 years ago. So this is sometime after that when sea level is rising and no other landforms are there. At time one, sea level is still rising. The sea level high stand doesn't happen until 5,800 to 6,000 years ago. But the volume of sand accumulating has outpaced the rise of sea level. And so beaches are still building or are now building and prograding outward from the dune ridge and bypassing around this southern headland. And some sand was able to bypass around this northern headland and migrate around into the bay as a subaqueous bar, filling that channel that we talked about earlier, until the channel couldn't migrate any further because it hit the headlands and the subaqueous bar filled in the channel. So now we move forward in time, sea level is falling. And because sea level is falling, there's less accommodation at the front of the headlands on the eastern side and back in Babatonga Bay on the western side of the headlands. And that means that headland bypassing is happening more quickly. There's less space between the surface of the water and the bottom of Babatonga Bay, especially because there was that subaqueous bar that acts as a platform for the new spits bypassing around the headlands to build on top of. In time three, we have a date for these spits that's about 1,200 years old. The accommodation on the eastern side of the headlands is filling in so that even more sand is able to bypass around the northern headland and build off of the spits on the back of São Francisco do Sul. And then time four, accommodation is even smaller. Babatonga Bay is filling in a little more. We're closer to modern. The spits are accumulating more quickly, which means that they're not accreting all the way onto the shore, which means that there's space between the sedimentary landforms that allows marsh to form. And now we're back in the modern, where you can see the marsh between these spits down here, and you can see the spits accumulating really, really quickly around the top of São Francisco do Sul. But I want to draw your attention to what's happening off this Capri spit on the end of São Francisco do Sul. You can see there's actually a submerged platform, which, if you remember, there was one off the back of the two headlands 6,000 years ago. And that submerged platform filled some of the accommodation in Babatonga Bay and is allowing this spit, the Capri spit, to grow over subaerially over the submerged platform. So now we have an understanding of how land was able to grow when sea level was still rising 6,200 years ago. We have an example of land building as sea level was falling. And then we have a modern example again of how land is building when sea level is rising again in a similar way to what we interpret happened 6,200 years ago. So from that, we've made a broad conclusion that the volume of available accommodation controls downdrift sediment accumulation. And so there has to be a balance between filling that accommodation in order for landform to be expressed subaerially. I'd like to thank my advisor, Chris Hine, for helping me with the REU this summer and transitioning my work into my senior thesis, and everyone at the REU program that made this possible, my work this past summer possible. Are there any questions?